Imagine waking up to a world that looks exactly the same as it did the night before. The same streets, the same homes, the same people moving through their routines, unaware that within hours, everything will be overturned, not metaphorically but literally, the ground itself rising, flipping and collapsing as if the very earth has been commanded to reject its inhabitants. This is not the imagination of a storyteller trying to shock you. This is a reality preserved in the words of the Quran, a moment so severe that Allah chose to describe it with a name that carries the sound of destruction within it. Al-Muqtafika, the overturned cities. Before going deeper into this powerful story, take a moment and stay connected. It truly means something. Let me know where you are watching from, and if your heart finds value in these reminders. Subscribe and stay with this journey, because these are not just stories, they are warnings, lessons, and reflections meant for every generation that comes after. The word Al-Muqtafika does not just describe what happened, it reveals how it happened. These were not cities that slowly declined or faded into dust over centuries. They were lifted, turned upside down, and crushed in a single divine command. The Quran does not treat this as a distant legend or a symbolic parable. It speaks about it with clarity and repetition, as if to ensure that no one can dismiss it as something irrelevant or disconnected from reality. When Allah mentions these cities, it is always tied to a message, a reminder that what happened there is not locked in the past, but remains a living warning. It forces you to ask a deeper question. What kind of people reach a point where the earth itself is turned against them, where mercy is no longer extended, and where angels are sent not to guide, but to execute judgment? To understand that, you have to go back to the people who lived in those cities, the people of Lut, peace be upon him. They were not a struggling tribe living on the edge of survival. They were established, comfortable, and surrounded by resources. Their lands were fertile, their lives structured, their society functioning. There was no external crisis pushing them into desperation. What makes their story so striking is that their downfall did not come from hardship, but from corruption that grew from within. It began with a behavior that the Quran describes as something unprecedented, something no nation before them had committed. They approached men with desire instead of women, abandoning what is natural and lawful. But the Quran does not present this as a private sin hidden behind closed doors. It shows a society where this behavior became public, normalized, and even defended. Their gatherings became places where immorality was not only practiced but displayed. There was no sense of shame left, no hesitation, no attempt to conceal what they were doing. Instead, they reached a level where they would openly challenge anyone who spoke against them. This is where the story shifts from individual wrongdoing to collective corruption. When a sin becomes embedded into the culture of a society, when it is no longer seen as wrong, but as something to be accepted and protected, that is when the danger deepens. The people of Lut did not simply fall into error. They built a system around it. They reinforced it socially, defended it publicly, and rejected any attempt to correct it. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how they responded to those who called them back to what is right. Allah sent Lut, peace be upon him, to guide them not as a distant outsider, but as someone among them, someone who understood their lives and spoke their language. His message was not complicated or filled with abstract ideas. It was direct, clear, and rooted in both morality and revelation. He called them to return to what is pure, to abandon what they had normalized, and to recognize that their actions were not without consequence. There is a deep sincerity in the way the Quran presents his doubt. You can almost feel the weight of his concern, the urgency in his words, or the hope that his people might still turn back before it is too late. But instead of listening, they responded with arrogance and mockery. They did not just ignore him, they ridiculed him. They turned his message into something to laugh at, something to dismiss. And then they took it further. suggesting that he and those who followed him should be expelled from the city. The reasoning they gave is captured in the Quran with a kind of irony that cuts deep. They said that these are people who want to remain pure, as if purity itself had become something undesirable. This is the moment where you begin to see how far they had gone, when what is right is seen as strange, and what is wrong is seen as normal. Lot stood firm despite all of this. He did not soften the truth to make it more acceptable, nor did he abandon his message to avoid conflict. He continued to warn them, to remind them, to call them back again and again. This persistence is not just a detail in the story, it is part of the lesson. Guidance is not delivered once and then withdrawn. It is repeated, emphasized, and reinforced, giving people every opportunity to reflect and change. But with each warning, their resistance only grew stronger. Their hearts became harder, their responses more dismissive, their behavior more entrenched. There is also a deeply personal dimension to this struggle. Lut was not only facing rejection from his community, he was experiencing it within his own home. His wife did not support him, did not stand with him, and did not accept the message he was sent with. Instead, she aligned herself with the people, in sharing in their mindset and their rejection. This adds a layer of emotional weight to the story that is often overlooked. It shows that even prophets, chosen and guided by Allah, are not shielded from personal trials. It also reinforces a powerful truth, that guidance is not inherited through relationships, but accepted through belief and sincerity. As the situation continued to unfold, the gap between truth and falsehood became wider and clearer. Lut's message remained steady, grounded and consistent, while his people became more defiant and more open in their rejection. They reached a point where they were no longer simply ignoring the warning, they were challenging it. They demanded to see the punishment he spoke about, as if daring it to come. This is a dangerous turning point in any story of calm, to when people move from denial to provocation, from ignorance to arrogance. It is the moment when the final chapter begins to take shape, even if the people themselves cannot see it. What makes this story so powerful is not just what happened in the end, but how it got there. It was not sudden, not unexpected, not without warning. It was the result of a process, a gradual shift from awareness to indifference, from indifference to acceptance, and from acceptance to pride. And once a society reaches that final stage, where wrongdoing is no longer questioned but defended, the consequences are no longer distant possibilities. They become inevitable realities waiting for their appointed time. As the tension between truth and corruption continued to grow, the life of Lut, peace be upon him, became heavier with each passing day. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes when a person stands for what is right, while everything around them begins to shift in the opposite direction. It is not just disagreement, it is isolation that seeps into every part of life. Lot was not calling strangers from a distance. He was speaking to people he had lived among, people whose habits and voices were familiar to him, yet that familiarity began to feel distant as their values drifted further away from what he was sent to uphold. The more he spoke, the clearer it became that he was no longer seen as one of them. His words were not just rejected, they were treated as a threat to the way they wanted to live. What makes this phase of the story so intense is not loud conflict or visible destruction, but the quiet erosion of connection. Lot was surrounded by people, yet completely alone in belief. He carried the weight of knowing what was right, while watching an entire society confidently move in the wrong direction without hesitation or doubt. There is a moment in the Quran where their response reveals everything about their mindset. They said, "Expel the family of Lut from your city, for they are people who seek to remain pure." This statement is not just a rejection, it is a reversal of values. Purity, something that should be honored, became a reason for exclusion. Righteousness was no longer admired, it was unwelcome. That kind of environment does not just challenge a prophet, it tests patience at its deepest level. Lut continued to call them, not out of obligation alone, but out of genuine concern. There is a tone in his doubt that reflects care rather than anger. But he was not looking to win an argument. He was trying to save his people from what he knew would come if they continued on this path. But when people begin to take pride in what is wrong, advice starts to feel like an attack. Every word he spoke was filtered through their resistance, and instead of hearing guidance, they heard something they wanted to silence. Even within his own home, the sense of isolation did not ease. His wife did not share his belief or his mission. She did not support him in his call, and over time, her alignment with the people became clear. This is one of the most striking elements of the story, because it reminds you that closeness in relationship does not guarantee closeness in faith. Lut carried his responsibility alone, without the comfort of a supportive household. The home, which is often a place of refuge, and it became another space where the divide between truth and rejection existed. This deepens the emotional reality of the story, showing that the trials of a prophet are not limited to public rejection, but can extend into the most personal parts of life. Despite all of this, Lut did not stop. He did not withdraw, and he did not soften the message to make it more acceptable. He remained consistent, calling them back again and again, reminding them of Allah, reminding them of accountability, reminding them that what they were doing was not without consequence. But the more consistent he became, the more defiant they became. This is often how the final stages of rejection unfold. The message remains steady, but the response grows sharper, more dismissive, more resistant. Eventually, the people reached a point where they were no longer simply ignoring the warnings. They began to challenge them directly. They demanded the punishment that Lut warned about, as if daring it to come. This is not just disbelief. It is arrogance at its peak. When a people begin to invite the very consequence they have been warned against, it signals that their hearts have become so hardened that they no longer fear what lies ahead. It is a moment that shifts the entire trajectory of the story, because it marks the transition from warning to inevitability. Allah does not act without justice, and justice includes giving people time, sending guidance, and allowing space for reflection and change. The people of Lut were given all of this. The message was clear, the warnings were repeated, the opportunity to turn back was always present. But when every door to repentance is ignored, when every call to truth is rejected, the nature of what follows begins to change. The Arampt that once came in the form of reminders begins to transform into a different kind of response. Then, quietly and without announcement, the next phase began. Angels were sent, not as a spectacle, not with visible signs in the sky that would alarm the entire city, but in a form that blended into the world of the people. They arrived as men, travelers who appeared human in every way. This is a pattern seen in other moments within Islamic tradition, where angels come in human form as part of a test or a mission. But what made this arrival unique was the timing and the purpose behind it. When these guests came to Lut, he immediately felt a deep sense of concern. It was not because he recognized them as angels at first, but because he knew his people. He understood their behavior, their tendencies, their lack of boundaries. Seeing these guests, who appeared exceptionally handsome, only increased his worry. He realized that if the people of the city found out about them, the situation could quickly spiral into something dangerous. His reaction reflects both his awareness of his society and his protective instinct. Hospitality is a sacred value, and protecting guests is part of that responsibility. But in this case, the threat was not external. It was from within his own community. His unease is captured in the Quran in a way that feels immediate and real. He felt distressed by their presence, not because of who they were, but because of what might happen to them. And this moment builds tension in a very human way. It is not yet about punishment or destruction. It is about fear, about anticipating what others might do, about trying to prevent something before it unfolds. Lut welcomed them, but his heart was heavy, carrying the knowledge that the situation was fragile. And just as he feared, word began to spread. News traveled quickly through the city that Lot had guests. The same people who had rejected his message, mocked his warnings, and challenged his authority now moved with urgency toward his home. Their intention was not hidden, and their arrival was not casual. It was driven by the very corruption that had defined them, the same behavior that Lot had been warning them about for so long. In that moment, everything converged. The years of doubt, the repeated warnings, the rejection, the isolation, and all of it led to this single night. Lot stood at the threshold of his home, facing a crowd that no longer recognized limits, no longer respected boundaries, no longer responded to reason. The test was no longer theoretical. It was immediate, intense, and unavoidable. And what was about to unfold would not just reveal the depth of their fesed, it would mark the final step before the command of Allah would be carried out in a way that would leave no trace of their civilization, except a lesson for those who come after. The crowd did not arrive quietly, and they did not come with hesitation. They moved with urgency, with a kind of collective boldness that only comes when a society has completely lost its sense of restraint. The streets filled quickly, voices rising, feet pressing forward until the house of Lot was surrounded. This was not a small group acting in secrecy. This was a public display, a gathering driven by desire that had long since broken free from shame. The very thing Lot had spent years warning them about was now unfolding right at his door, undeniable, exposed, and intensified. Inside that home, there was a tension that could be felt in every breath. Lot stood between his guests and his people, carrying the weight of responsibility in a moment where everything felt fragile. Hospitality in his tradition was not a casual gesture, it was a sacred trust. To protect a guest was an obligation tied to honor, dignity, and faith. But now that trust was under threat. Not from strangers passing through, but from his own community, people he had called to truth again and again. The reality of that must have pressed heavily on him, knowing that those he tried to guide were now the very ones he had to stand against. When the people reached his door, they did not ask politely, they demanded. Their words carried entitlement, their tone stripped of respect. Lot stepped forward, trying to hold the line, trying to appeal to whatever sense of morality might still remain. He called out to them, reminding them to fear Allah, reminding them not to disgrace him in front of his guests. There is something deeply human in that moment, not just a prophet speaking, but a man pleading with his people to hold on to even the smallest fragment of decency. He was not asking for perfection, he was asking for restraint. For awareness, for a moment of reflection before crossing a line that could not be undone. Then he offered them a lawful path, something pure, something permitted, something that aligned with the natural order that Allah had created. He pointed them toward marriage, toward relationships that were rooted in dignity and responsibility. But what makes this moment so heavy is not the offer itself. It is the response that followed. They rejected it completely. There was no hesitation, no reconsideration, no sign that his words had reached them. Their desires had already taken control, and when desire becomes dominant, reason begins to fade. Their response revealed just how far they had gone. They made it clear that they had no interest in what was lawful, no concern for boundaries, no respect for the sanctity of a home or the protection of guests. This was not just a moral failure, it was a complete collapse of structure within the society. The lines that define right and wrong had been erased. Naaman in their place was a new standard shaped entirely by impulse. At that point, the situation was no longer about individual sin, it had become a collective condition, something that defined the identity of the people as a whole. Lot's distress grew heavier. You can almost feel the pressure of that moment, the urgency in his voice, the desperation in his appeal. The Quran preserves his words in a way that carries both strength and vulnerability, showing a prophet who is standing firm, yet fully aware of the danger unfolding around him. He knew that this was not just another confrontation, not just another rejection. This was something different, something final. The years of doubt had led to this point, and the response of his people left no room for doubt about where they stood. Then, in the middle of that tension, something shifted, and the situation, which seemed to be on the verge of breaking into chaos, was suddenly interrupted by a revelation that changed everything. The guests who had been at the center of Lut's concern were not ordinary men. They were angels, sent by Allah with a mission that had already been decided. Their presence was not a coincidence, and this night was not unfolding randomly. It was the precise moment where the unseen decree of Allah intersected with the visible actions of the people. The angels spoke, and their words carried a calm authority that immediately transformed the atmosphere. They reassured Lut, telling him not to fear, not to be distressed. The people who had gathered outside, no matter how forceful they seemed, would not be able to harm him or his guests. This reassurance was not just comfort, it was a declaration of protection, and a confirmation that what was about to happen was under divine control, not subject to human interference. Then came the message that marked the end of everything Lot had been trying to prevent. The time for warning had ended. The faucet for repentance had closed. The command had been issued. The destruction of the people was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. This is one of the most sobering moments in the entire story, because it shows the transition from mercy to judgment. For years, mercy had been extended through reminders, through patience, through repeated calls to return. But when those calls are rejected completely, when the opportunity for change is dismissed over and over again, the nature of what follows changes. The angels gave Lut clear instructions. He was to leave during the night, not in the morning, not in the open daylight, but under the cover of darkness. There is a precision in this command that reflects the seriousness of what was about to occur. He was to take those who believed with him, those few who had accepted the truth despite the overwhelming pressure of their environment. And then came a detail that carries a deep emotional weight. They were told not to look back. This instruction is not just about physical movement, it carries a deeper meaning. It represents a complete break from what was behind them. The place they were leaving was not just a location, it was a society that had reached its end. Looking back would not change anything, would not save anyone, would not alter the decree that had already been set. It was a moment of separation, a clear line drawn between those who would be saved and those who would remain. And then came the mention of Lut's wife. She would not be among those who left. Despite being in the same home, despite being married to a prophet, she would remain with the people and face the same fate. This is one of the most striking aspects of the story because it reinforces a principle that runs through the Quran again and again. Guidance is not inherited through proximity. It is not guaranteed by relationships. It is accepted through belief and rejected through denial, regardless of who a person is connected to. The weight of that must have been immense. To leave knowing that not everyone you know, not even those closest to you, will be saved is not a simple act. It requires trust in Allah at a level that goes beyond emotion, beyond attachment, beyond what feels natural. Lut was not just being told to leave a city, though he was being told to accept a reality that carried both relief and sorrow at the same time. As the night deepened, the instructions became the only focus. There was no time left for further doubt, no space for additional warnings. The process had moved beyond that stage. What remained was execution, the carrying out of what had been decreed. And while the city outside continued in its state of ignorance, unaware of what was approaching, inside that home, everything had already changed. The truth had been revealed, the decision had been made, and the final moments before the Avab had begun to unfold. What makes this part of the story so powerful is how it captures the final intersection between human action and divine response. The people had shown clearly who they were, not just through their beliefs, but through their actions, their responses, their refusal to change. And now, the response from Allah was about to reflect that reality in a way that would leave no ambiguity, no confusion, no room for interpretation. The stage had been set, the command had been given, and the night that seemed ordinary to the people of the city was about to become the last night they would ever experience. The night did not feel like the end to those who remained behind. It carried the same quiet rhythm as any other evening, the same familiar stillness settling over the city, the same sense of normalcy that had wrapped itself around their lives for years. There were no signs in the sky that forced them to pause, no tremors beneath their feet that warned them to reconsider everything they had built. This is what makes that moment so striking, as the final hours before destruction were not marked by chaos, but by calm, a calm that often comes just before a decisive shift that no one expects until it arrives. Within that darkness, Lot moved with purpose. There was no hesitation left, no uncertainty about what needed to be done. The instructions had been given clearly, and now every step carried weight. He gathered those who believed, a small group, far smaller than what one might expect after years of doubt. This is a detail that speaks quietly but powerfully. Truth had been present among them for so long, yet only a few had chosen to hold on to it. Numbers did not determine reality, and majority did not define correctness. In the end, guidance rests in the hearts of those willing to accept it, even if they stand alone. They began to leave under the cover of night, walking away from everything that had once been familiar. The homes, the streets, the places filled with memories, all of it was being left behind without the possibility of return. This was not a temporary departure, not a journey with the intention of coming back. It was a complete separation, a final step away from a place that had reached its end. The command not to look back lingered with them, not just as a physical instruction, but as a reminder that what lay behind them was no longer part of their future. There is something deeply reflective in that instruction. Looking back can sometimes be driven by attachment, by curiosity, or by hesitation. But in this moment, looking back would have meant holding on to something that had already been judged. It would have been a pause in a process that required complete trust. So they moved forward, step by step, through the darkness, guided by certainty, even when the full reality of what was about to happen had not yet unfolded before their eyes. Among them was the absence of one who had been part of Lot's life, his wife. Her presence was missing not because she was forgotten, but because she had made her choice long before that night arrived. She had aligned herself with the people, with their mindset, with their rejection, and now that alignment carried its consequence. This part of the story does not present itself loudly, but it carries a weight that settles deeply. It reminds you that proximity to truth does not guarantee acceptance of it, and that every individual stands accountable for their own response, regardless of their surroundings. As the small group continued their departure, for the city behind them remained unaware. Life moved on within its walls as it always had. Conversations continued, gatherings remained, and the same behaviors that had defined them persisted without interruption. There was no collective realization, no sudden moment of clarity that caused them to stop and reflect. The warnings that had been given for so long had already been dismissed, and now there was nothing left to interrupt the path they had chosen. Then came the moment when everything changed. It did not begin with a gradual shift or a slow unfolding. It came with precision, with power, with a force that reflected the authority behind it. At the break of dawn, when the first light begins to touch the horizon, when the world transitions from darkness into day, the punishment descended. And the Quran describes this moment with an intensity that leaves no room for ambiguity. The cities were lifted from their foundations, raised as if the very ground had been commanded to detach itself from its place. And then they were turned upside down. This was not symbolic. It was a physical overturning, a complete inversion of everything that once stood stable. The Allah that had supported them, that had carried their homes and their lives, became the instrument of their destruction. It rose, flipped, and collapsed, burying them beneath what had once been beneath their feet. The name Al-Mu'tafika captures this moment perfectly. They were not simply destroyed, they were overturned, their world literally reversed in a single, decisive act. As this happened, another layer of punishment unfolded. Stones began to rain down. Not ordinary stones scattered randomly, but stones described in the Quran as being made of baked clay, marked and sent with precision. Each one carried a purpose, each one directed, each one part of a calculated response that reflected the exact nature of what had been committed. This was not chaos, it was order within destruction, a manifestation of justice carried out with absolute accuracy. The sky that had once been a source of light and balance became the channel through which this punishment descended. The Allah that had once been stable became unstable, then reversed. Everything that they relied on, everything that they took for granted, turned against them in a moment they could not escape. There was no place to run, no structure to hide within, no barrier that could protect them from what had been decreed. And what makes this even more profound is the timing. It came at a moment when they least expected it, after a night that felt ordinary, after a life that had become predictable. The shift into destruction was immediate and absolute. This is a pattern that appears in other moments of divine punishment as well, where the arrival is not preceded by visible warning signs that force belief, but comes suddenly, leaving no opportunity for last-minute change. The time for that had already passed. For those who had left with Lut, the distance between them and the city became a line between safety and destruction. They were spared not because of their strength, not because of their numbers, but because of their belief and their response to the message that had been given to them. They had accepted what others rejected, and that acceptance now separated them completely from what was unfolding behind them. The scene of destruction, as described in the Quran, is not meant to be imagined lightly. It carries a weight that is meant to settle in the heart, not just as a story, but as a reminder. The Allah being overturned is not just about physical movement. It reflects how the people themselves had overturned the natural order, how they had reversed what was meant to be upheld. And the response mirrored that reality, turning their world in the same way they had turned their values. When everything was finished, nothing remained as it once was. The cities that had been filled with life, with movement, with activity, were gone. In their place was a transformed landscape, a sign left behind for those who would come after. Now, the Quran refers to it as something visible, something that can be seen and reflected upon, not hidden or erased, but preserved as a warning. And this is where the story moves beyond the past. It is not only about what happened to them, but about what it means for those who hear about it now. The destruction of Al-Mu'tafika is not presented as an isolated event, but as a lesson that continues to speak. It reminds that when truth is rejected consistently, when warnings are ignored repeatedly, and when corruption becomes a point of pride rather than something to be corrected, the consequences are not distant or theoretical. They are real, they are decisive, and they arrive at a time when they are least expected. The Allah that feels stable can change. The systems that seem permanent can collapse, and in the patterns that feel normal can be overturned. What remains constant is the principle that runs through this entire story, that guidance is given, warnings are delivered, and the response to them shapes what comes next. What remains after such a destruction is not silence, it is a message that continues to echo long after the people themselves are gone. The story of those overturned cities was not preserved to fill pages or to satisfy curiosity. It was preserved because it carries a weight that speaks directly to every generation that comes after. Allah mentions Al-Mu'tafika repeatedly in the Quran, not as a distant event buried in history, but as a living reminder placed in the path of those who are willing to reflect. It is as if the ruins themselves are still speaking, not with words, but with presence, to asking anyone who passes by to pause and consider what led to such an end. There is something deeply striking about how the Quran refers to the athar of these people. It points toward what remains, toward traces that can still be observed, particularly in the region near the Dead Sea, an area often associated by scholars with the remnants of those very cities. This is not presented as a coincidence. It is described as a sign, something visible, something that exists not just for the eyes, but for the mind and the heart. The Alad itself becomes a witness, holding within it the memory of what occurred, preserving it in a way that no written record alone could achieve. And yet, the presence of a sign does not guarantee reflection. People can pass by such places, see them, even acknowledge their history, and still walk away unchanged. And this is where the story deepens, because it is not only about what is shown, but about how it is received. The Quran repeatedly calls on people to think, to reflect, to use their understanding. It is not enough to know that a nation was destroyed. The real question is why and whether the patterns that led to that destruction can be recognized in other times, in other places, even in the present. The people of Lut were not destroyed without cause, and they were not destroyed without warning. This is a principle that runs through every account of divine punishment. Allah does not act unjustly, nor does He hold people accountable without first making the truth clear to them. The message was delivered repeatedly and patiently. The opportunity to change was always there, open and accessible. What closed that door was not a lack of guidance, but a consistent refusal to accept it. This is where the story becomes more than a historical account. It becomes a mirror. It asks whether people today recognize the same stages that unfolded then. It began with an act that was introduced, then tolerated, then normalized, then defended. Over time, it became embedded into the structure of society until questioning it was no longer acceptable. Those who spoke against it were not only ignored, they were pushed aside, labeled as outsiders, and treated as if they were the problem. This progression did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually, step by step, until it reached a point where reversal became almost impossible. There is a lesson here about how societies change, about how values can shift slowly until what was once clearly understood becomes blurred, and then eventually reversed. The people of Lut did not wake up one day and suddenly reach that level of corruption. It developed over time, reinforced by acceptance and strengthened by repetition. And perhaps one of the most important aspects of this lesson is how it highlights the danger of silence. When wrong is left unchallenged, it begins to grow. When it is tolerated, it becomes familiar. And when it becomes familiar, it starts to feel normal. But alongside this warning, there is also a powerful example of steadfastness. Lut, peace be upon him, did not change his message to match the environment around him. He did not dilute the truth to make it more acceptable. He remained consistent, even when that consistency cost him comfort, connection, and support. His story is not only about the destruction of a people, it is about the strength required to stand firm when everything around you is moving in a different direction. And then there is the reminder of personal accountability. The story does not allow anyone to hide behind relationships, status, or proximity. The example of Lut's wife is clear and direct. She lived in the same home as a prophet, heard the same message, witnessed the same warnings, yet chose a different path. Her outcome was not changed by her connection. This reinforces a principle that is repeated throughout the Quran, that each person is responsible for their own choices, their own response to truth, their own acceptance or rejection. The destruction of Al-Mu'tafika also serves as a reminder of how quickly circumstances can change. A society that feels stable, established, and secure can reach a point where everything shifts in a moment. The people of Lut were not expecting what came. Their lives continued as usual until the very end. This unpredictability is part of the lesson. It challenges the assumption that stability will always continue, that consequences are always distant, that there will always be more time. At the same time, the story reflects the balance between mercy and justice. Before any punishment came, there was guidance. Before any destruction, there were warnings. This shows that Allah's mercy precedes His judgment. He gives time, He sends reminders, He opens doors for change. But when those doors are consistently closed, when guidance is rejected again and again, the nature of what follows changes. Justice is not separate from mercy. It is part of it, thus ensuring that dhulm does not continue without consequence. And perhaps one of the most powerful takeaways from this story is the idea that signs are not only found in the past, they exist in the present as well, in patterns, in behaviors, in the way societies respond to truth. The story of Al-Mu'tafika is not locked in a specific time or place. It is presented in a way that allows it to speak across generations, to remain relevant, to continue offering guidance to those who are willing to listen. In the end, what remains is not just a story of destruction, but a call to awareness. It invites reflection on choices, on values, on the direction in which a person or a society is moving. It asks whether warnings are being recognized or ignored, whether truth is being accepted or dismissed. And it leaves behind a clear understanding that what happened before can happen again, not necessarily in the same form, but through the same patterns, the same stages, the same progression from awareness to denial. The Alad that was overturned now stands as a silent witness, a reminder that no matter how stable something may seem, it is always under the command of the one who created it. And the message that rises from that ground is not one of fear alone, but of opportunity, the opportunity to recognize, to reflect, and to choose differently before the moment arrives when choices are no longer possible.